Okay, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. His name is Kris Van Orsdel. Kris is the Director of Infrastructure and Local Government in the New York Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, and he has experience working three of the largest disasters in the U.S. These include Katrina, the BP oil spill, and Superstorm Sandy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to Kris.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. How was lunch? Was it good? All right. So we saw earlier today that there's a lot of journalists in the crowd, and particularly a lot of young journalists. So what we're going to do today, I need, when you're sitting back there thinking you're going to get through this, we're going to do a fake press conference at the end of this. I want to ask how many people here have ever been interviewed public officials, stood in a meeting and interviewed a public official? Has anybody been to a meeting of your local government and asked your mayor a question? Good. So you can pretend that I'm Filipino, because I know I look exactly like that. All right, so let's get started. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to say that it's unfortunate that I'm coming to such an amazingly beautiful country under such sad circumstances. But it really is a fascinating place with some of the most kind people that I've ever met. Thank you for your hospitality. I come from a place that's actually very similar to where you live. I come from the Gulf of Mexico, and has anybody ever heard of Houston, Texas? Has anybody ever heard of New Orleans and Katrina? Yeah? All right, so we live in the same sort of environment. We have hurricanes every year, what you call typhoons. Most of our people live in rural areas, and they're fishermen or they're farmers, or they work offshore. And we have one big city, which is New Orleans. And in 2005, New Orleans suffered the largest hurricane in the United States history. It's exactly the same sort of storm that happened here in Tacloban. It was bigger than anything the United States had ever had happen to it. And our response from the perspective of the United States government and what we did with working with local governments and with the mayors, and I worked for the governor, was very similar to what you're going to be going through now and where you are today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as being the same and what is being different, and I'm going to give you examples based on the United States, but you should remember that what I'm talking about is very the same. It's a very similar place. It's very hot in the summer. It rains every day. And then we wait for the rain, and then the hurricanes come, and then we clean it up. And what we decided to do was to change it. And we had a slogan that was build it back safer, stronger, and smarter. And I've heard here you want to build it back better. And that's what you should be thinking about. And for those of y'all that are young, and most of you are, this is going to take a very, very long time. And it's going to be something that through social media and the work that you're going to be able to do to be actively involved in the recovery of your communities is critically important, because you have a unique opportunity to change things. It's very rare that you get this much money that ever comes at one time, and you can either decide to make it be how it was before, or you can make it better. And that's the power of people, and it's the power of being engaged on the ground. And remember that every single day you get up and you try to make it a little bit better, and you'll find that it will get better. So let's get rolling. So we're here today to talk about the media. And I want to start with a quote, because I'm not a journalist. I make policy. I'm a policymaker. I would be considered a bureaucrat or a politician. But what you've heard here today and what you guys are learning is that the media really matters. And I think some of you know who this guy is that's sitting up here. That's Anderson Cooper. We have a saying, you never want to see Anderson Cooper. If Anderson Cooper comes to your house, there's a problem. Something isn't going well. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, we were 5 days into our recovery. The storm had passed, the city was flooded, people were dead, there was bodies in the streets. And Anderson Cooper was talking to my senator, who actually is an amazing person. And if you read this quote, she calls up Anderson Cooper, who's in downtown New Orleans. It's black. He's in Mississippi. And she says, "Thank President Clinton and former President Bush for their strong statements of support and comfort today. I thank all the leaders that are coming to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama to help our rescue. We are grateful to the military assets that are being brought to bear. I want to thank the senators for their extraordinary support." And then she stops. That's what politicians say, right? They say the nice thing to make everybody feel good. Then she turns around and she says, "Anderson, I don't know if you've heard this, but today in Congress, we, in an unprecedented action, gave $10 billion to give more money so that we could continue to start to fix up Louisiana." Anderson Cooper, who's on the ground in Louisiana, very similar to how you were here in your first 5 days, says, "I haven't heard that, because for the last 4 days, I've been seeing dead bodies in the streets here in Mississippi, and to listen to politicians thanking each other and complimenting each other, I got to tell you, there are a lot of people here who are very upset, very angry, and very frustrated." Sound familiar? And when they hear those politicians talking to one another, it really gets them mad, is this end of this story. So the takeaway here is that, then he finishes up with, because he was seeing bodies on the street being eaten by rats, and he called her out on public television, the biggest arena, because that story needed to be told. The next day, we're still in the same situation. Anderson Cooper's been on CNN. The head of our emergency management, the head of our disaster recovery group, goes to Dan Rather, who's one of America's greatest newscasters. And he gets on and says to him, "Well, we just learned about the convention center today." That's your Astrodome. "We just learned of the convention center," we being the federal government. Ted Koppel, I'm sorry, not Dan Rather. Ted Koppel says, "Don't you guys watch television? Don't you guys listen to the radio? Our reporters have been on it for more than just today. It's been 5 days." Analogy, when you started tweeting, when you started telling your story, that's where we were then. The media brought attention to a problem that the federal government didn't know about because there was so much bureaucracy involved. So your role coming down the road is what I have asked around what you're hearing today. Learn the lessons from the gentlemen that have been before me. Listen and be part of Argos. Listen and be part of the long-term process, because you're going to have a voice and it's going to be important. I'm also going to say this, and I want you to hear it. Don't always assume that the politicians and the people that are working to help you always know the answer. Don't always just jump to a conclusion that they're wrong and they don't care. Often, it's an example like this. They're running around trying to do a million things, and they need information and they need insight. So, "All politics is local" is a great quote. This is a quote about Tacloban and some of the challenges you're having that I could find. Being local. Our mayor in New Orleans, who you heard about earlier, who was promptly convicted of corruption, in the first few days after the storm, nobody was coming to help. He got really frustrated. He called the mayor, he called the governor, he called the president. Nobody was listening to him. He got on the radio and had one of the greatest outbursts that most of us have ever heard, which essentially said, "Now get off your," I'm going to say, "get off your asses and let's do something. Let's fix the biggest goddamn crisis in the history of the country." And he was mad. You could feel it through the radio. I put this quote up here because I think it's the same for you. It's time to get bound to recovery. It's time to start fixing it all up. And I think you've got some people that want to feel that way. The second is our governor is a governor in New Jersey who's Superstorm Sandy. Did things change between 2005 and 2011? No. The governor in New Jersey, which is next to New York, he had to go out and get really mad at Congress because Congress didn't give him any money to start to do anything. New York and New Jersey got hit by Superstorm Sandy, and it took over 3 months for them to get any money. Any money. because of politics. And there isn't room for politics in disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is about helping people, restoring lives, and being dignant to those who lost their lives and looking forward. I'm bringing this up as a point to let you know, as challenging as it is today, even in the United States, where we have lots of money and the federal government can help and we have resources, it's a long, challenging process. It's largely done. Politics and policymakers kind of interject in 4 ways through this process. And again, it's not always bad, but there's major elements about how disaster response works and how you move through this process. There's stages of disaster recovery. We're going to go to that in just a second. The second thing that's very different necessarily between you as a person or your family is that if you're a policymaker, you have to define your recovery goals, both in the short term, what do I need to do today, versus what do I need to do over the next 5 years? How do I use this money the right way while also doing what I need today to help you out? The average person, when you're trying to build back your life or you're trying to find a job, you worry about what you need today. You're not thinking about 7 years down the road. But if you want to be a good public servant and use that money right, you have to think short term and long term. Finally, as journalists, one of the things that's going to be important for all of you to recognize, because this is going to be very, very complicated, is always remember to know what the working relationship is between the people that are getting the money and the funders who are giving them. That means NGOs give money to do certain things, federal government gives money to do certain things. Always be sure when you're learning the process that you know who is doing what and what's the relationship. Because if you don't, when you ask your questions or you ask me as a policymaker and you don't know what you're asking, it gets complicated and then you don't get the responses you want. The next one is the same point. Know your funding sources. There's millions and millions of pesos here, right? Lots. Those pesos aren't free pesos. They have to go to housing, they have to go to food, they have to go to infrastructure. If you know what the funds are for, it makes you better in asking the questions to get what you want, either to tell your story or to find out how to make your community better and where you are in the process, because all money can't be used for everything. Finally, and this is one of the things that I think is one of the most important things that we learned after Hurricane Katrina, it's the main reason I'm working in the state of New York right now, and the reason I worked on the BP oil spill. You have to have a very strong bottom-up community engagement process. People have to have a voice in their recovery. It's actually in the best interest not only of the local towns and people, it's not only in your best interest, it's in the best interest of the nation. Because if you have buy-in and you're part of the process, you'll help to make sure it's successful and you'll help to make sure the money is used in the right way. We did this in the United States through a community planning process. After Hurricane Katrina, we went out and talked to every town and we said, what would you like to do with your money? And we built a plan. And when we got that plan, by the time we started to spend the money on the plan, the people knew what we wanted to do, and so they were supporting of the plan. In New York, we've taken it a step farther where we actually went and we met with people and we said, what do you want? What would be your desires? And they came back with a plan, and then we went to the towns and said, we need you to do this. I know there's a lot of questions right now in Tacloban between the local plan versus the federal plan. And one of the things that it seems that I'm hearing is there's a disconnect between what the local plan is and what the federal plan is, and they have to come together because all politics is local. You're the people that are going to be on the ground, but you're going to need help from all the other people at the table, which is why it's important to do the final thing, which is your role and the role of Rappler and everyone else, which is a long-term look at the media being engaged for the long haul and asking for transparency so you can see where those dollars are going. So the 4 stages of disaster recovery. You've got right after the storm, you have post-storm emergency response. This is largely what happens when the food comes in, when you unfortunately have to take care of the dead, when you figure out how to clean out the roads, and you start to clear away the debris. In the United States, after Katrina, this took us a long time. We had, as a result of Hurricane Katrina, it cost us 5.3 trillion pesos to fix it. It took us 6 months when our city was closed that we allowed people in during the day and out so that we could clean up the city. You didn't have that opportunity here. Usually at the end of the first year, when you're at the 1-year anniversary, you've taken care of emergency response and you've stabilized the housing situation. The single most important thing after the storm and taking care of those that lost their lives is making sure people have a house. Not necessarily a new house, but having a roof over their head where they're safe. Again, I want you to hear this because I know it may not make you feel better, but it may let you know that you're not alone. In Louisiana, people didn't always get where they wanted to live. They had to live, we put these tents, see this picture over here on the right? This one right here? I know many families would love this. That was downtown New Orleans. There wasn't a house left. We had people living in these what you have as tent cities, went to this, and then we eventually built them houses. I think it's, at this point in time, I don't think you're where you would like to be at the 1-year anniversary in terms of stabilizing your housing and your emergency response. And I don't think you've got your long-range planning down, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to do that. You're at the 1-year mark of something that's going to take years. The final phases of recovery is that you start to rebuild. And you don't necessarily have to just rebuild it how it was before. You can rebuild it and make it better. So real quickly, the win-ways, the short term and the long term is really hard. You guys have to remember as journalists, and you have to remember from a policy perspective, that every day the policymakers have to decide where they are with the short term and the long term. They have to align not only the goals of a person that shows up and says they need a bed or they need a tent, but they've got to figure out what the community wants, and they've got to make sure that it's done in a way that the money's safeguarded. This is another slide that I put up because this was also happened to us in Louisiana. At the first-year anniversary, people were saying the money was not going fast enough. How does the money go? Why isn't the money on the ground? I heard you have $10 billion and I don't have a check. There may be some reasons for that happening, and I can tell you that from what I've heard here, it could be going better. But let me give you a policymaker's perspective of why it could be slow. It takes a very long time to figure out how to crank up a machine to put money out when you're not used to spending this much money. You can't overnight just figure out how to give everybody money. You have to figure out how to do it, so again, you know your funders and you figure out what you're going to do. So stay on top of this. Demand from your elected officials, your local mayors and your federal people to do this, but realize that it's a normal thing that happens. This is the funding source question, which I would remind each of you to think about here if you're going to ask somebody about process of how you're going to use the money, what the money is being used for. Program requirements, what can I use the money for? How long do I have to use the money? Does it go away? Can I use it for just what you're telling me, or can I use it for anything if I have a need? And what in reporting requirements is, the answer is, how am I as a citizen going to know that you use the money the right way? What I would tell you is the NGOs and the nations that provide you resources have pretty transparent mechanisms that you'll be able to see if the money is being used the right way. You may not get it from your government. You may be frustrated, but you'll find that these people do. The other thing that I know from talking to young people in the United States, and I know you're no different, you guys can find things on the internet faster than anybody I've ever seen. It takes you seconds to figure stuff out on the internet. Follow your hunches and drive to find the money, and you'll find an answer to the recovery problems. This is your city. I put this up here because we had a community engagement process. And while it may not be perfect right now, the Philippine nation, on paper, is saying that they're going to have a community engagement process. If they've said they're going to do it, hold them to it and make them do it and use the power of people. Finally, in the long term, the thing that's going to make your recovery work for the next 5 or 6 years is constantly staying on top of the transparency and making sure you know where the money's being spent, but also making sure that you have an ability to look at things in the short and long term and that you're staying on top of it. I can tell you from my perspective that every single day from a policy, it's like running a 100-yard dash, but I run a marathon that takes me 5 years. So what I try to always tell my staff and the people I work with is, let's look at the short term, but focus on the long term. Stay engaged with the community and make sure we're always going down and talking to people, because people matter. And if you follow some of these ideas along with the presentations before, I think you're going to be in really good shape. So what we're going to do now, like I mentioned earlier, because I think one of our goals for this is, at least for me personally, is you're going to be doing this for a very long time, and there's billions of pesos that are going to be in play. And one of the things that's really important is learning how to ask questions about difficult subjects, or how to ask questions when you don't know all the information, so that you can build a relationship to figure out, to get to the bottom of your story. That doesn't mean you always have to agree with the policymakers. I have a lot of friends who are in the press, and we will disagree. But there's a way to ask questions, and there's a way to be inquisitive, as opposed to just taking what the government tells you, or just reading the press release and blogging about what's there because of what's there. So I want to try something, and I don't know if it's going to work, but y'all are journalists, and so what we're going to do is we're going to put up a couple of scenarios that are going to be written up. I'm going to give you a minute to read them. And then what I want to do is, with our colleagues who are from the journalists that have been speaking before, I want to have people ask me questions, and we're going to try to get an answer to some of the questions that are up here. So you're going to read something that's going to sound a little bit familiar, and then we're going to have a little fake press conference, and we're going to do 2 or 3 things on it. One of the jobs of kind of the press, from my perspective, is not giving up. So I hope that there's more than one person that raises their hand. So here's the first question. Let's pretend that I'm a government official, and I come out and I say this. My government is today announcing that the executive director who leads the disaster relief effort for my administration will be taking an unpaid leave of absence while an inquiry is performed into the activities of his budget director, Ms. Jen Jones. While the investigation is being conducted, my deputy director, Eric Campos, will assume these responsibilities. It's the government's position that while no funds have been identified as missing, it is in the best interest of the government for Mr. Smith to step aside until the review is complete. I'll now take your questions. How would you ask a question to this? Sure. Go ahead.
Sorry. I'd like to call on Roy Moraleta. He's the anchor of IBC 6 and the senior correspondent of Tacloban Headlines. Is he here? Roy, are you here? Okay, please come over. And the second one, the second volunteer is Jeff Manibay of Cat 8 TV Network. He's the owner of Cat 8 TV Network, and he's director and broadcaster. Please come forward. Thank you for volunteering. So let's give Kris a hard time.
Yeah. So what you should be thinking about here is, the goal here is to try to take some of the lessons you've learned today by listening and ask a follow-up question that you would ask of an official if you saw this in the paper. Whichever you guys want to give it a shot. It's just to try to teach. Sure, yeah, sit. How are you? Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
It's a pleasure.
Same here. Thanks for coming to Tacloban.
Sure, so we had to, executive director had to sit down. Do you guys have any questions about our announcement today?
I'm far side, and
Yeah.
I can't see.
Okay, hold on. Let me do this. Sorry. I'll move the chair aside so you can read the questions. All right?
Okay.
There.
So we also have a couple others I can move with.
You're supposed to ask the question.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're the journalist.
All right.
Yes.
Oh. All right. So I'll answer this one and then we'll go to the next question because there's three. Here's the question that I would have asked immediately. I would have said, why is he on an unpaid leave of absence? I didn't tell you what he did. Reread the sentence. If you look at this and you read it, all I've said in the official press release is there's an unpaid leave of absence. I haven't said why. I also have put somebody else in that you've never heard of before. And I've put him into a position where it appears on paper that somebody did something wrong with the budget. My first question would have been, what did he do? And the second question is, who is Eric Campos? And how do I know he's not going to do whatever it is? The next question would have been, why aren't you stepping down? The goal of this question goes back to an earlier goal today, which I think is really, really important, and we'll move on. Remember the conversation about corruption and the perception of corruption? My goal here in this example is to reaffirm that as a journalist and people, if I'm on the other side, if you accuse me of something that I haven't done, the probability is I won't be very willing to work with you again. But there is a way as a journalist to ask me that hard question so that you get clarity to what you want, and I can work with you down the road. If you would have asked me that question, I wouldn't have had a problem. If you would have said, your boss is corrupt, I would have said, my boss isn't corrupt. He has stepped down while it is ongoing. Okay? Here's the next one. This one has to do with, and I'm going to set the table for you guys. This one has to do with what happens when money goes out. The government is announcing today that $200 million, so $200 million in recovery funds are being made available for infrastructure recovery projects as a result of Yolanda. Funding for this project comes from NGO and federal sources. These projects will take 3 years to complete and are anticipated to generate considerable economic opportunities for businesses and persons with differing skills, yet they may result in dislocation and change. The government is committed, we're committed, to ensuring that funds are used properly. We can now take any questions you have on this very important infrastructure project.
Yes.
They might have to
Might be on. It's on.
Hello.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. $200 million of funds are being made available. What part of what part of the 200 million are readily available, and what are its priorities given the challenges faced by the affected communities and their residents?
That's a good question. What we're trying to do is jumpstart the local economy, and so we're going to be putting $200 million into 3 different road sections, 3 different projects. We're going to do a road project. We're going to build a school with some of the money, and then we're also going to make sure that we repair the airport.
May I ask the question? You said that the government is committed to ensure funds are properly used. What mechanism have you devised to properly monitor the disbursements of these funds and to track the downloading of these funds to the beneficiaries, sir?
Great question. So the answer, what we're doing from our administration, as we've done all along, I want you to ask back. What we've done all along in our administration is our administration has always been very transparent with how we don't put money out on the street. We have a number of websites that are available where you can look to find how we've done previous projects in the past. I think if you look to our previous history, you'll find that we were always very transparent.
Well, I've heard almost similar answers when I always ask the same kind of questions like that. But the problem is, there would always be problem of gaps. You see, how much percentage goes to logistics, how much percentage goes to the actual beneficiaries, and this is not very clear and not very accurate in this most of these websites, sir.
Right. So what we're going to do on these projects, because we've heard from the citizens, is we're going to put them up on a public website because we've heard that there's a lot of requests similar to yours to break down the use of these funds. So we will be putting up a transparency website that can show and track these dollars, and we'll go from there. So I got one more because I'm going to run out of time. So here's what I was going for on this one. The 2 gentlemen asked the really important question. If you read the first sentence, for you guys that are new, does the first sentence tell you what the $200 million goes for? It says nothing about that. All it says is there's $200 million. It also doesn't tell you how much $200 million is out of how much I have. Right? If I'm putting all $200 million into 3 projects, you're not going to have houses. You're not going to have economic development because I just spent all the money on 3 projects. So a good question is, the first question is, what did you use the $200 million for? Most important, what percentage of this is the money of Yolanda? If we're just getting going, I would say it's 2%. We're going to do a lot more projects. The second thing here, which is we didn't get to, but the most important question is the last one here, which is important that I've heard in Tacloban and in Philippines. Demand transparency. In the modern era, everyone knows where the money goes. It's infrastructure projects, it's local government, you're building schools. There's ways to ask for that in a manner so that on the websites you can start to track that. There's NGOs called Transparency Internet. There's a number of NGOs that can help you get there. But by asking for transparency, you can watch that $200 million be spent over those 3 years. Now, the question y'all didn't ask, which I'm going to say here is, I think is really, really important. You have got to make sure that you've got economic development, livelihood as you call it, jobs that are coming off this money. You have to ask for that. You have to continually say, we want to have the jobs. We know, we've heard that 70% of the jobs have to be locally hired. That's phenomenal. But when these big projects start, you need to be part of the process. You need to be doing these construction jobs because you may not be able to fish for 6 years. You may not be able to fish. You may not be a farmer. But if you're building these jobs, you'll have sustainability and income and a way to move into something else. And more than likely, you're going to make a lot of money because there's a lot of money with disaster jobs. Here's the final question. Again, this one may make a little more sense to you from what I've heard last night. I'm going to be a mayor now. I'm not going to be with the federal government. I'm going to be local. Mayor Johnson would like, and I'm a press secretary. Mayor Johnson would like to issue the following statement regarding the announcement by the federal government that it will not accept the town long-range recovery plan and will instead require it to implement the federal long-range disaster recovery plan for the area. His response was, I think the federal government is taking a short-sighted approach in forcing us to implement this recovery plan. They are out of touch with the situation on the ground, and while I support the nation, I do not see how this top-down plan will assist us with recovery and lead to a more resilient and better community. I'm open to take questions as to why we believe our approach is more sound. The idea here is you've pitted the local versus the federal. You have to work together. How do you raise those questions?
Sir, could you briefly discuss to us, very briefly, and compare your short-term approach to that of the federal long-term approach?
Sure. Our short-term approach starts with a bottom-up decision-making process. We worked within our communities. We talked to our communities to build our long-range plan, which was devised around job generation in the short term, and over the long term, turning those into jobs and economic sustainability so the money stays here.
How do you find this better than the
Federal government, what the federal government should have done when they wanted to come and talk to us about how to repair my town is included us in their process, and they did not do that. I would welcome their opportunity to come and speak with us, but as to date, they have not shown up and asked for my assistance.
You obviously do not agree with the federal government position of that top-down distribution. What in particular, what particular problems do you see as far as being the mayor of this town? What particular problems do you see if that particular policy is implemented towards addressing the problems in your community?
Well, clearly in our neighborhoods, which are as complicated as they are, a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't work. What works in the downtown doesn't work up in the north. And the solution that they're being asked for is to build roads in areas that are on fault lines. They're asking us to move people from one area to the next because they don't want us to build there. What they should have done is we need to be having local support, and they need to incorporate the needs of our individual neighborhoods into the planning process, because otherwise they will build something that no one will use, or it will be not feasible.
This is obviously a general statement. To which government official are you particularly delivering this message to? Who in particular in government do you want this statement heard?
This statement would be directed towards the ministry that's working on the problem. I understand this, and this statement is directed towards the ministry. While I understand that the cabinet is run by the president, we are all part of the nation. We want to work together, but I'm specifically referring to the work of the ministry and not consulting us.
You're obviously concerned about the length of time, the period that it'll take the funds to come down to your community. How long do you think you can sustain yourselves in, say, the next 3 months? Do you have the capacity to sustain your community in the next 3 months, given the fact that the federal government will take a long time to deliver the assistance?
We're very frustrated with the pace of how things are going right now, but we believe that if we can start a dialogue as a result of seeing the two plans, that we could find consensus to be there. So this is the final question. I thank you guys. Give these guys a hand for helping out. So they really narrowed right in on the subject here. So this one right here, unlike the money question or about are you corrupt question, is down and dirty politics. Who wins, who loses, how's it going to work out? The question that they got to in the end is, who was I directing my anger at? And if you heard my reply, which is what I'd recommend to you all, is try to coach it. I tried to coach my reply in a way that would not lead me to be excluded from future conversations. I kept to try to keep the door open for conciliation. I was strong, and that I believe that my local approach was better, but I never specifically called out the president. I said that was directed at the ministry. And then I came and I said I would welcome the dialogue for them to come and accept our plan. So if I'm the policymaker and I'm reading the paper, and you've done my interview and you took those quotes, the back and forth here very clearly pointed to my anger by the answer to the question, but my response means that I'm still open to dialogue. And when you're talking about 5 years to 6 years of recovery, and this isn't going to happen over and over again, you have to create partnerships. And so I know this is reality here today, and it's what's going to result in long-term planning. And so my takeaway from this little exercise is 2 things. Every single one of you could ask the question, I'm old, I'm from the United States, but you know your neighborhoods better. You could stand up and ask any question you want of the press. In the press or as a citizen, you should feel empowered to ask your elected officials questions. It is an important part of democracy. Democracy is based on the views of people asking questions of their leaders. They may not always give you what you want, but you deserve a seat at the table. And when you have billions of dollars that are specifically going to recover your area, put your voice out there and let it be heard. I'm sure you've tweeted. I'm sure you would Facebook it. That's less personal. You're going to connect with more people. But don't ever underestimate, and I'm going to say this so you really hear it. I always remember everyone that asked me a question because it gets personal. I am much more likely in a meeting when somebody walks up to me and says, my house needs to be fixed or my school's not fixed, and I will remember them and go back to my office and figure out what I can do, than if somebody just sends me an email and says the school's messed up. Feel empowered to ask questions. Be inquisitive and keep faith. It's going to be a long time, but it's going to get a lot better here over the long haul. Thank you all so much.